And good morning, Ospreys. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives, and I and Olivia the Osprey, who is up here above my this hand, there she is, wish you a happy morning, and we are very happy to be once again talking to our friend Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche Organization, and he is way over in Potsdam, Germany, graciously spending a little of his afternoon and sharing our morning and his afternoon. So TikTok time is money, says the chat room lady, our person, Lolo Holmes. Okay, Lolo. Well, let's get going with our chit chat then. And apologize for starting a couple minutes late. I apologize for it, but you know, one thing you can be sure of is we might start late, but we always quit on time. All right. That's what we used to say in the music business when I used to do gigs, you know. Anyway, Harley, how are you doing, man? It's good to see you again.
I'm doing pretty well. We're finally getting spring here in Potsdam.
Yeah?
It's been a long time coming, but we're finally getting up to the 70-degree mark.
Nice. We've had the most amazing spring. All of my flowers are going nuts, and it's just been beautiful weather. You know, we've got plenty of rain, but then it's nice and pretty when it's not raining. It's been a remarkable season, and you just drive around and you see all the beautiful flowers and other greenery everywhere. Yeah, reminds you that life is good.
Our tomato plants died because it froze the other night.
Uh-oh, you put them out too early, didn't you?
It was our mistake.
Well, the rule around here is Mother's Day. So legally, according to East Coast Maryland rules, you were legal.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm sure there'll be some more tomatoes in your life. So let's move on. I noted you published on Twitter this morning a commentary. You've been very busy. I have read two of them in the past couple of days, and it seems like you must spend an awful lot of time composing your essays. It's a fabulous work product you put out, and everybody should definitely check it out at LaRoucheOrganization.com. So, Harley, what do you think you'd like to start with this morning in terms of our discussion?
Well, we could start with the infamous rules-based order, which, if you look around, you wonder who's making the rules. You know, the last couple of days, including on Saturday, I did a longer presentation on what's happening in the Middle East and how, you know, the idea that this is somehow that you can encapsulate it by looking at what Israel's doing, what the Palestinians are doing. Forget it. This is the continuation, or you could say the culmination of 130 years of manipulation. And you know, the whole idea that somehow you can turn it off and stop it and just have an agreement without fundamental changes in the way people are thinking just doesn't work. And that's why what I focused on was what Yitzhak Rabin said at the time of the signing of the Oslo Accord with Bill Clinton and with Yasser Arafat, when he was being challenged by his opponents in Israel. How could you sign an agreement with someone who's our enemy, with Arafat? And what Rabin said is, well, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And that evening in the banquet at the White House, he said that he'd like to make a toast to the courage to change axioms. And Rabin, as you probably know, John, was quite a brutal enforcer of the Israeli policy against the Palestinians up until the time of Oslo. He, in fact, was in charge of the Israel Defense Forces when they were putting down the Intifada. And because of the concern that people would see Israeli soldiers shooting Palestinians, he said, take them away from the cameras and break their bones. But it dawned on him at a certain point that would never result in peace, because if you have to do that, you not only bestialize your enemies, but you bestialize your own people. And so that was the basis of the change at the time. And most importantly, Rabin understood that you needed, and this is largely the influence of Shimon Peres, but also especially the influence of LaRouche, you needed an economic change, that you couldn't do it through politics. You couldn't get a handshake agreement and put away the bitterness. You needed to do something that would benefit each side. And that was the economic protocols that were part of the Oslo Accord. But these were never carried through. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund refused to allow the funds to go to the Palestinian Authority because they said it was corrupt. Arafat would steal the money. And so the earth never moved. And so from 1993 to the present, you've had a continuation of the status quo of the Palestinians with very little power, very little voice, very little resources, and the Israelis with the clubs and the weapons. And so you could have an explosion like this at any point. What's going to change it? You need reconstruction. You need economic development. And that's why we're very hopeful that there could be an agreement, probably on the level of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council, to stop these wars but replace them with economic development. And in that region, in Southwest Asia, what's needed is the Belt and Road Initiative. Instead, what do we have? We have the Great Reset, which is just going to continue the same anti-development economic policies. So, I think it's clear what needs to be done. The question is, where are the people who will do that?
Yeah, well, thank you. I wasn't all that I didn't have the Middle East and the peace process in my mind when you started delving into it. Would you remind me, when was the Oslo Accords? What year was that?
1992-93.
Okay.
And the reason it's important is not just that it's happening now, but because it's much broader than the Palestinians and the Israelis. What are we going to do about Syria? What are we going to do about Iraq? What are we going to do about Afghanistan and Iraq? And you see the tendency from Blinken, who tours Europe. Now he seems to be in Europe almost every other day, talking about the rules-based order. Well, what rules-based order gives the go-ahead to Netanyahu to blow up buildings and housing in Gaza? How is that a rules-based order? What rules-based order says we can starve Syrians or starve the people of Yemen with sanctions, as Blinken calls them, humanitarian sanctions? So, look at it this way: what rules-based order allows you to bomb a building that houses the media, Associated Press and Al Jazeera? That building in Gaza, a 12-story building, which is almost entirely international press, was leveled by the Israelis after a 1-hour advance warning. And the reason they gave was there were terrorists in the building. Now, the reason was for the same reason Julian Assange is still in prison, because the first casualty of war is the truth. And the truth has been a casualty of this situation since the British decided to move into the Middle East after the 1880s, really, when it was clear the Ottoman Empire was going to collapse and that the British wanted to be in there instead of letting the Russians and the Germans be in there.
Willingness. The word that comes to my mind is willingness. There are 1,000 paths to peace, but somebody has to start taking steps in that direction, or nobody will ever get there. And while the weaker side in any of these conflicts is the one that most desperately wants the peace, of course, the stronger side is the one that has not yet achieved its goal, whatever that goal is, and that's why they're not ready for peace.
Well, the goal, John, is to subordinate the other side to accept the rules that are coming from the powerful. That's what the rules-based order is. The rules-based order has nothing to do with international law, because international law essentially says things like you can't interfere in other countries' internal affairs. You can't impose sanctions that kill people to carry out a regime change. That's a violation of international law, but apparently that's acceptable in the rules-based order that's been brought into being since the second Iraq invasion. It actually goes back to something Tony Blair was trying to do in the 1990s, which was to get the world to drop this idea of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War in the 1600s. And that idea was you recognize international borders and you don't interfere in the affairs of other nations. And then you act in the interests of your nation and other nations. Blair said that's outmoded. We have to get rid of the Westphalian order. And he advocated what Samantha Power and Susan Rice and the Obama administration and now Tony Blinken believe is the responsibility to protect. But to protect who? Are we protecting the Israelis by having a constant state of war there? Do we protect the Syrian people when we arm and train Al-Qaeda terrorists? It's nonsensical. But that's the world we live in. And that's why you're absolutely right. The question of willingness, the reason I started with what Rabin said is that you have to have the courage to change axioms, to recognize that what you're doing is not going to succeed, and you have to look for another pathway. And Rabin paid for it with his life. He was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli extremist.
So many assassinations in this war. I was just reviewing my copy of one of my favorite contemporary books and authors, Stephen Kinzer's book, The Brothers, about the John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. And the subtitle of the book is the Dulles Brothers and Their Secret World War. And I submit that this secret world war is they're carrying on the British policy that you and I often talk about on behalf of, the intermediary of the Wall Street bankers, but it's all one policy. And the policy is secret war. It says so right there on the cover of the book. And I think it's a very apt thing to remember. That's a picture right from the cover of the book. And John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State, and his younger brother, Alan Welsh Dulles, was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency during the 50s up until John Foster Dulles died in 59, and Alan got fired in 61 over the Bay of Pigs. But they reigned, for a good decade, the foreign policy of the United States. And it was all secret, wars from Guatemala to Iran to Indonesia, all around the world, running things for the banks because they were lawyers. They worked for a company called Sullivan and Cromwell, and that was the big law firm for all of the really deep state money in Wall Street. So the United States, although they happen to have a title as, Secretary of State, DCI, that's just another client. Their real clients are the banks. I mean, those are the ones that have paid the bills and put them in a position to have these high offices in our government. Excuse me for getting on a soapbox for a minute, but this is war, and the war ain't over yet. And so the question does arise is that if you are seeing yourself and your culture and everything being suppressed and turned into serfdom, is there a point where you are justified in using violence? And unfortunately, we've seen tremendous, horrible violence on part of everybody here. But the question is, Harley, is Israel intending to be an apartheid state, or is it intending to be a democracy? And I don't think Israel has been clear on that question.
Well, I think this is why you have election after election where no party gets over 33, 34% of the vote. Netanyahu uses this argument that he's tough, he won't let the Palestinians kill you and take over the country. So you need a strong figure. He goes back to what was called the Jabotinsky wing of Zionism, which is Greater Israel,
Mm.
which had a belief in a concept called the Iron Wall. You had to have an iron wall that would separate the Palestinians from the Jews and convince the Palestinians that they had no authority, that they had to submit fully to what they were getting from the Israeli government, and only then would they be granted rights. That's what you mean when you say apartheid. That's Israel is, in a sense, an apartheid country. Now, on the other hand, there's a large section of the population of Israel that doesn't like that, but doesn't know what to do. I mean, you have the left is impotent. The Labor Party's collapsed. Its last leaders were Rabin and Shimon Peres. They try to bring military figures in now on the left, but they never really amount to much. So within Israel, you have something that's completely controlled and manipulated. You know what? Very much like the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States. I just want to go back to what you were saying, though, about Wall Street, because people know the Dulles brothers. They may know people like Dean Acheson, Averell Harriman. This was a crew of bankers that emerged in the 1920s. Thomas Lamont was another one. Davidson of the Citibank. These were the people who essentially established the intelligence community. Uh, FDR tried to control it somewhat through Bill Donovan, but Donovan was another Wall Street lawyer. And essentially, after Roosevelt died, this was the crew, the Wall Street pro-London crew, that moved in and established the intelligence community. Now, there were patriots, as you know very well from the work you're doing on your father and his network. There were still patriots who had a different view of what America's role should be in the world. And that was that we shouldn't carry out coups, we shouldn't carry out assassinations. We should aid nations in their development instead of suppressing them to keep them in a semi colonial status. So, what you see with Israel and the Palestinians is kind of a microcosm for what we see with the City of London's policy toward the rest of the world. That you have the power that uses the banking system to suppress the colonies. And if anything, it gives them jobs and cheap labor, cheap raw materials, but no sovereignty, no power over controlling their own lives. And that's what Perkins' book, Economic Hitmen, was all about. So, we keep replaying this post-war confrontation between what some people wanted to do, which was to allow independence. I mean, I think after 1960, de Gaulle wanted to break the colonial power, but he ran up against the French establishment. Kennedy certainly wanted to do that from the United States, and look where it got him. So we still haven't fully broken, or we haven't broken at all, really, with the power of Wall Street and the City of London. Now it's spread out a little bit more to Brussels and Frankfurt, but the policy comes from the same center, which is Chatham House, British intelligence, its interconnection with the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. And then you have all these other groups that people know about, but they all take their marching orders from these global bankers.
And that's my question then. What can we do that hasn't already been tried to address the control that these global bankers have already got over all our politics, everything? I mean, people say drain the swamp, drain the swamp. That was what the battle cry for the Make America Great Again Trump supporters.
The plug to pull to drain the swamp.
Yeah, he didn't have the plug. He didn't have the plug, did he? Or he couldn't find it.
This is really the issue, and we're laughing about it, but this is the issue as to whether or not our nation will survive as a republic. That if you allow private interests to have control over money and credit, control over security, and now control over through social media and so on, the way people think and what they read and what they can find out, in other words, censorship, then you begin to question whether there is an option. But look, in 1962, 63, as Kennedy was evolving, we had an option then, a chance to change. And I think there were a number of mistakes that were made, mainly because it was fought in private and behind closed doors. Uh, with Trump, there was an attempt to bring it out into the open, but for reasons that I still don't fully understand, he relied on some of the same people who he knew were deep in the swamp. You know, why you bring in a John Bolton, a Mike Pompeo, an Esper as defense secretary? Why you rely on Steve Mnuchin, who was basically a swindler who took advantage of the mortgage-backed securities collapse in 2008 to buy a bank that made him supremely wealthy? You know, why would Trump, if he wants to drain the swamp, bring in the swamp people? And some of the apologists say, well, they knew what they were dealing with. Well, no, they didn't. You know, there was this line at one point when the CARES Act was passed that Trump was actually nationalizing the Fed and putting it under the Treasury. And I don't remember if you and I talked about it, but I went on a number of different programs and said, that's not what's happening. If you really want to outflank the private bankers, do you put Larry Fink of BlackRock in charge of it? That's putting the weasel in charge of the henhouse. And people said, oh, no, no, Trump has a plan. He's going to use this to take over the Fed and break up the power of the Fed. Well, the Federal Reserve has more power today than it ever had. But to get to your question, how do you break this? I think that we have to keep informing people in the United States what the fight really is, that it's not, it has to be bigger than Donald Trump. It has to be to revive the constitutional traditions of the Hamiltonian banking system, of the commitment to the Constitution and the idea that the government is there to serve the general welfare, the principle of sovereignty. But then, secondly, look around the world and see where there are countries that could be allies in that. And this is where a lot of the Trump supporters and conservatives are blindsided. They, for example, some of them think Israel is our great hope. Uh, Many of them think China and Russia are enemies, when in fact, if we were conscious of what this fight is, I mean, the government, if Biden or whoever's president were conscious of this fight, you could ally with Russia, ally with China, and break the power of the globalists. That is, the unilateral world order is very weak right now. It's only strong because the rest of the world has submitted. But China hasn't submitted. Russia hasn't submitted. That's why there are regime change operations against both of them. That's why there was a regime change operation against Donald Trump. So I think we were much closer in 2017 and 2018 to breaking the power of the swamp. But for whatever reason, Donald Trump pulled back from pulling the plug. So rather than waiting for Trump to have a second chance, I think it's got to be a lot of people, a lot of citizens who engage in the kind of educational process and discussion process so that we can recruit a growing number of people to this idea of what a self-governing republic should be.
Well, I'm certainly with you on that. I want to do my part, and I think education of the public is the biggest problem we have. It's a tall order to suddenly get everybody to understand the actual fundamental values of the United States, since they've been obscured so well during our entire lives. And the idea of the virtuous citizen has been entirely erased from our culture, and instead you get these heroic figures. You know, it's everything from Superman to the Marvel Comics people to, you know, it's everybody just sits back and watches life happen now, you know, and say, oh, there's a hero over there, he'll save this or that hero, you know. So you don't ever think of yourself as a hero, which is what really you need to do in order to become that ideal virtuous citizen that the founding fathers idealized in their classical educations and culture.
And John, think about the when you talk about the broader cultural question, think about in the 1940s when we had movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or It's a Wonderful Life, where you did have the hero was the virtuous citizen, the citizen politician, in the case of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, or the honest mortgage banker in the case of It's a Wonderful Life. There was a different morality then. We've been corrupted by especially the post-1960s. On the one side, the environmentalism, the craziness against the idea of an industrial economy, that we have to have free trade, take advantage of other countries' cheap labor, and then live off that. And too many people had comfortable living based on stock market appreciation and so on, that they fail to remember that a stock market doesn't produce wealth. Physical goods production is the basis of value added to the economy. And so we've lost that understanding. And so that's why people are looking for someone else to provide them with the golden goose, instead of figuring out how we get our government back to the point where it will defend the virtuous citizen and the entrepreneur, as opposed to rewarding the swindlers and speculators and penalizing the honest man and woman, the small shopkeeper or the small businessman, what they call in Europe the Mittelstand, the small and medium enterprises.
And let's add on to that the cost of all of their failures when they do things like try to destroy Syria, and then you get the refugees. The refugees come into Europe. Why? Where else would you go? You want to live. You want your family to have a chance, and so they all go into Europe. But, the people that caused the war didn't pay for the housing and the educations and the welfare of all of these new immigrants. And they didn't smooth the way by creating pathways for them to come and hopefully integrate into a completely different society. They did none of that. And so that burden, too, falls upon the middle class, or the people that otherwise are trying to make a living to support their families, but find their income constantly diluted by the needs that are created, not by themselves, not for their families, but in order to serve the needs of this blob or this deep state, or the banker's dictatorship, which I think is your term and probably the best way to say it.
But that's a very important point, John. I live here in Germany, where for a period of time you had these riots, these Syrian or Middle Eastern refugees. And it was actually much smaller than the media portrayed it, but it was a disruption. But why did people come to Germany or to Italy? Because they were facing death and destruction in Syria. Before the civil war started in 2011 in Syria, and especially before the US started providing arms and weapons and training to the terrorists, people were not leaving Syria. There were not floods of refugees running away from the Assad government. And many of the people who came to Germany really wanted to go back to Syria. They didn't really feel comfortable in Germany, but what was there to go back to? And so the problem was that the refugee crisis was not caused by the refugees, it was caused by the war. But instead of coming out and speaking out against the continuation of the war, the Europeans went along with the unilateralists of the United States and the United Kingdom. We did that in Libya. We did that again in Syria. We're doing that again by funding the Saudis and backing the Saudis and destroying Yemen. Just because of the blockade of the ports, the people from Yemen can't go anywhere. Same thing with the Palestinians. They can't leave Gaza. So, you blame the victim, and you don't realize that you yourself are becoming a victim of the same deep state or the same war machine, military industrial complex. And this is where an education comes in. And I do think more people figured out over the last 4 years that these wars were not good for the United States, were not helpful, were not increasing our security, were not a sign of US beneficence. But then you come up against the question of what do you do when both parties in the Congress continue to support the wars? And we're seeing that again right now with the whole battle over will we actually withdraw from Afghanistan? And you have a whole grouping in both the Democratic and Republican parties saying it's a mistake to leave, saying the same thing, that it would be a mistake to get out of Syria until Assad is gone. Well, what business is ours to determine who's the leader of these countries? And that's where you see the disconnect between people who are angry about seeing things go into chaos, but not having a handle as to what to do. And then when you add the media, when anyone speaks out, for example, and defends the government of Syria or defends Putin, you're a Putin apologist. You're a proto-communist KGB flunky, which is essentially what they were saying Trump was. So it's a lot to fight, but I think the one hope is, and I think you've discovered this from the research you've been doing for the last years into not just the situation with your father, but the whole environment around him. The hope is that people will discover the truth and will eventually be moved by it. Now, whether we can do that before we lose the country is the big question. Do we still have time? And that's why I know you feel an urgency. I feel an urgency. Lyndon LaRouche was always driven by this urgency. And some people said, well, that's his fanaticism. Well, if you want to protect the world from these maniacal networks, you can't be calm about it. You have to inspire people's passion, and passion not just as anger and enmity against the people doing this, but for love of humanity. That's got to be the most powerful emotion that we use in this fight, is to appeal to people as empathetic, caring human beings. And that's what's been driven out of the American people with this materialism and this superhero culture and so on.
And it's also driven out of everyone who kind of joins the war. Said, yeah, I'll take my piece. I want to be the Duke of Avalon when it's over. I want to own a little piece of Ireland, and I'll have all the little Irish people be my serfs. That kind of nobility thinking is still there in cultures where they never had a democratic experience. At least in this country, we have a great bit of history during periods of time when I think our government really was functioning as a servant of the people. And we are unique in that in many ways. I mean, other countries can claim that they've had periods of it, but the United States is built on the principle of the government serving the people, which is where you started this morning. But I think we have to keep. Let's go back to one point. I made myself a footnote because you said something about Republicans that I think equally applies to Democrats. So let's be fair and balanced here, because my hope is to reach across this wrong boundary of Democrat Republican and turn it into a people of goodwill and empathy versus people of no goodwill and no empathy. And in other words, I call them the elites, or sometimes I call them, but let's just say the people that go by the rules of Thomas Malthus and Adam Smith, that if you don't have money, then you're worthless. There's nothing beyond what you see, what you can carry with you, what you value is only measured in dollars and cents or assets you can hold. The value of humanity is one of the great points that you guys make, LaRouche himself and then the Schiller Institute is carrying on the battle to remind people that we're more than just pieces of flesh and bones. We're humans. We're people. We have reason. We have these God-given talents, and I do say God-given, as they came from somewhere. And we are going to lose it if we don't stand up, get up, stand up. As Bob Marley, one of my favorite singers, says, get up, stand up for your rights. If we don't do it, we will lose it, and we're losing it quickly.
But John,
I
certainly would not exempt the Democrats. I think I said there's a bipartisan consensus around the war machine and around continuing these wars and continuing to support the bailout of Wall Street, the globalization policy, the International Monetary Fund, American unilateralism. A lot of the people who were partisans in both parties voted against Trump's desire to pull troops out of Syria and Afghanistan. So I certainly don't give the Democrats a way out, because I think both parties are totally dominated by this military-industrial complex. But that's part of the problem. People still see the country in terms of parties, and what you were just saying is really important. The division is not Republican, Democrat, left, right, liberal, conservative. The division is the oligarchical system and its view of man versus the Republican with a small r, or the Platonic conception of man as a unique being with the potential for creative reason and the ability to make discoveries of principle in the universe and to apply those discoveries to the means of production to improve the circumstances of life for everyone. That's what productivity is. When you make a discovery of principle and apply it, whether it's in a machine shop or in an assembly line or in an office, where you make these discoveries that enable you to increase the productivity of the entire workforce. And that's the general welfare. And that's what Hamilton argued the government should do. He didn't say the government should determine where every bit of credit goes and who gets it. And what he said is that there should be an availability of credit for anyone with an idea that can improve the general welfare. That's the American system, and we have had that. There are times where we saw tremendous improvements in the standard of living for a growing segment of the population. Again, this is what happened after World War II with the post-war economic development policies. This is what, I don't know how conscious Eisenhower was of it, but he did things that did improve the overall wealth of the country. We had a growing middle class. Kennedy was working on that. And then we shifted to this trickle-down view in the 80s, which was originally a Republican view, but then was grabbed onto by the so-called third-way Democrats, including Clinton and Al Gore. So we are dominated by neoliberal economics and neoconservative strategic policy. And the people need to understand there is an alternative to those views, which is called the American system.
You just said a word that I had an interesting discussion with Garland Nixon over last night. Garland is a journalist and commentator here based in Washington. I imagine you do know him. Well, anyway, Garland's said neoliberalism to people on the left is the same thing as globalism is to people on the right. And I was like struck by that. I thought about it for a while, and I asked him, define neoliberalism for me so I can make this connection. And it turns out you just said the same thing. In other words, but you connected it to the economic policy. In other words, this is Keynesianism and extension of that Well, right now is the time for us to seize these opportunities and to say, hey, look, we're all saying the same thing. It is, you called it the phrase third way Democrats, which Garland calls ultra liberals. The people that are so far beyond liberal that they're just completely a fraud. There's nothing progressive about these people. They are completely sold out and part of the banking system.
But John, let me make a point on this, because it's important to understand that neoliberals include Keynesians, but also Friedmanites, because the original term of liberal when it came to economics was no government, was free reign for the private sector. That's what liberalism was in the 19th century in Britain. And our founding fathers were not liberals in that sense. They believed there had to be rules and regulations, that the government had a right to step in and limit the power of private individuals and private networks. And then neoliberalism became essentially the idea that all government is bad. In the case of Keynes, what Keynes had in common with Friedman is the idea that monetary policy is the most important thing, not the physical economy. And so you had a merger of the old British liberals with the more modern democratic liberals, which occurred around something called the Democratic Leadership Conference in the 1980s. But it was also modeled on what Tony Blair did in England, where the Labour Party abandoned the labor unions and became the party of the wealthy shareholder class. So what we're really talking about is physical economy versus shareholder values. And the neoliberals argue that however you make your money is good, and the government should stay out of the way and let you do whatever you want. And that's how we got the bubble economy that's blown up repeatedly in the last 30 years, in the late 90s with the Asia crisis, and then the LTCM crisis, then the dot-com bubble popped, then the mortgage-backed security bubble, and now today the everything bubble. Bubbles are a product of getting government completely removed from any regulatory process. Now, I'm not saying government should have the power to regulate everything, but when it comes to something like credit, when it comes to monetary values, you have to have someone that makes sure there's a level playing field. You don't have that today. The Wall Street crowd dominates through the Federal Reserve and through the central banking system worldwide where credit goes. And they're trying to give it more power. That's why it's so funny. They call it liberalism, but they're concentrating more power in the hands of the few, which, by the way, is how monopolies always get set up. You argue for a total free market, and then the people who are the biggest swindlers, who have the connections, are the ones who drive everyone else out and become the powerful force. So we're seeing a replay of all the worst elements we've seen in the last 200 years in the fight against the American system and Hamiltonian credit.
It's the Burr-Hamilton duel all over again. If you know what I mean, with Burr being the one with the unlimited banking ideas, and Hamilton wanting to have government regulation, right?
Remember where Burr went after he killed Hamilton? He went to London, and he was allowed to stay. He stayed with Jeremy Bentham, who was an operative of the British East India Company.
Yeah, and I want to get back to Republicans and things for a minute, in language. As neoliberal equals globalist, I think there's also a correlation between progressive and populist. And there's this issue there, which I want to talk about, because I think that people that MAGA people, the January 6th, the people that went down there, they didn't go down there to support a Mike Pompeo. or they didn't go down there to be part of, Mike Flynn's army. That they didn't go down there because they wanted a general on a white horse to come into town and say, I'm taking over. No, they went down there because they wanted to see Congress go through the actual hearing on the question of fraud in the election. And that is their perception of their constitutional duty as virtuous citizens, because they thought that the whole thing could come crashing down, and they wanted to be there as citizens, as witnesses. That is a populist point of view. It is always confused, I think, by people on the left with a couple of bad words like racist or elite, or in other words, the idea of populism has negative connotations to progressives. And conversely, I think the idea of progressives has negative connotations to populists, because to populists, progressives look like they're just ready to fall over the slope into communism.
Well,
So those are. I'll enjoy your comments on that.
Well, populism, there's a long history of populism in the United States. And the problem is that when it's connected to the idea of government for the people, it's a positive element. If you think of Lincoln's government of, by, and for the people,
Yeah.
A populist is someone who believes that's what government should be. It should be looking out for my interests and everyone else's interests. And if it's not, then we'll oppose the government, because the government will seem as an oppressive force. Now, what the progressives say a populist is today is someone who, in the middle of the 19th century, was called the Know Nothing Party. We don't know nothing except we want our rights. And there's an element of that that was manipulated, I think, by the intelligence community on January 6th. That there were people who were there for good, honest reasons, namely to make sure that the constitutional process was followed in determining who won the election. And instead, you had provocateurs who were unleashed to create the so-called insurrection. Now, as far as progressives, John, this is where it really gets interesting. Think back 30 years, 40 years. Progressives were people who distrusted the CIA, distrusted the intelligence community, knew that the FBI was running black bag operations against the anti-war movement, against the Black Panther Party, against the civil rights movement. Progressives were people who were anti-war. Today, people like Hillary Clinton considers herself a progressive. The worst elements of the war party inside the Democratic Party call themselves progressives. In reality, they're not progressives. They're the people who use identity politics, and especially sexual identity, racial identity, and so on, to distort the idea of a national mission. And I would say, rather than using these terms, what I looked at as positive from what Donald Trump was saying is that we have to have sovereignty, which means that the government acts in the interests of the people of the nation, not of any private interest. And then secondly, under sovereignty, you have a conception that the people can be called upon to defend those rights, not necessarily as an armed militia storming buildings, but to campaign, to be part of a campaign, to be involved in rallies. The so-called progressives think that when Trump goes out and speaks to 30,000 people, he's stirring up a hateful mob against justice,
Right.
when it's actually the opposite. So these are cases where where words were turned into their opposite for the sake of manipulation. And, for me, a populist is someone who distrusts government when he sees that government is controlled by these powerful private interests. And that's a good thing. We should all be suspicious when the Federal Reserve is able to advocate all power in its hands, including the power to make spending policy, saying that they have to do that on behalf of government because the government can't do it and the people don't know what's good. That's the kind of elitism that our founding fathers opposed. That was part of the debate as to whether we're going to be a democracy or a republic. And Hamilton and others came down on the side of the republic for the same reason Plato did, that in a pure democracy, you can manipulate people on the basis of their prejudices and their unreason. Whereas you need to have a capability to act in the interests of people who may not know what their interests are, but then you go out and educate them. That's what government should do. Show people what's the best thing, or a politician should do that. So, I think it's interesting you bring up these words because they're right at the heart. I mean, one other example very quickly. When Trump talked about sovereignty, what they said is he's talking about America first as America alone, isolationist. Well, in his UN address in September 2019, he said, we want sovereignty, but we want every other country to be sovereign. And that's the Westphalian order I was talking about earlier, that Tony Blair and his band of radical Jacobins tried to disrupt and end in favor of this idea of responsibility to protect the rules-based order and so on.
I'm really pleased with this conversation, Harley. I think you and I have made a lot of progress in terms of what I am trying to do is to show that we're all of us are people of goodwill, people who believe in the golden rule as opposed to people who believe in the rule of gold. You can quote me on that. That's original. Those of us that believe in the golden rule that's the core of America. That's the core of our values. Whether you're a Christian or not doesn't matter. What really matters is if you want other people to treat you the way that you would treat with them, and if you are willing to make the same commitment to other people, say, I will treat you the way I would like you to treat me. And that has nothing to do with race, nothing to do with identity politics, nothing to do with who your parents are or how much money you have or anything like that. And there's a strong current of that still in this country, but
that's Constitution
being broken down by the media and by these people that are supporting in their own way, whether they don't even know it, but they're supporting the banker dictatorship as they break down our sense of empathy and willingness to make that commitment.
And that's the reason people still have that deep down, is that's in our Constitution. But that's what's under assault right now, that idea that's in the preamble, that the purpose of government is the general welfare of the citizens and our posterity. And that's something that LaRouche emphasized over and over and over as a fundamental principle, which does come from the best aspects of religion.
Well, populists aren't ready to go run up the red flag. I'm sorry, progressives are not ready to go run up the red flag and pledge allegiance to Joseph Stalin. And populists are not a bunch of stupid goobers that walk around in KKK garb and ignore every bit of intelligent thought that they possibly can. These are the false narratives that we're pushed at us, and I really think that we need to take a hard look at the actual people involved, the people that went to January 6th. They're not a bunch of stupid, racist, nationalist idiots. The way that they are perceived now by a number of my friends, by the way, I don't understand how my friends can have such a low opinion of their fellow citizens and still vote for a person like Joe Biden. But but that's just me. I'm I'm very frustrated with the lack of civility and the actual interference of friendships that has happened as a result of this manipulation, this divide and conquer media that's been driving us apart in so many ways. But you and I, go ahead,
John,
Harley.
the good thing is that you're continuing to keep up the fight with good humor. And I think one of the great weapons we have is irony and humor. And that's one of the reasons I make so much fun of this idea of the rules-based order.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you so much, Harley. It's always a pleasure and a privilege. And I think we're doing some good here, Harley. I really do. I'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks, and if not before then. And, keep that up. Thank you so much.
Okay, good talking to you, John.
Okay. Bye. Good night, everybody. We'll talk to you later.